There is a specific kind of friendship that forms between men who have arrived at the same place by entirely different roads. The friendship is not built on similarity. It is not the comfortable recognition of shared background, or shared sensibility, or shared experience that produces most durable human connections. It is built on something more interesting and more unstable than any of those things, which is the recognition of a quality in the other man that the first man knows is real because he has developed enough of the same quality in himself to be able to identify it accurately when he encounters it in someone else. The quality is not easily named. It sits somewhere in the territory between genuine toughness and genuine honesty and the specific willingness to find out what is true about yourself even when the finding out is uncomfortable. Men who have that quality tend to recognize it in each other across whatever surface differences separate them, and tend to form around that recognition the kind of friendship that does not require regular maintenance to remain functional because the foundation of it is something more durable than proximity or habit. Steve McQueen and Chuck Norris had that kind of friendship. Snorts. They had formed it in the early 1970s in the specific environment of the Los Angeles martial arts scene, which in that era was small enough that every serious practitioner eventually found their way into the same rooms as every other serious practitioner, and the rooms were informal enough that what a man actually was tended to become apparent fairly quickly regardless of what he was outside the room. McQueen was already famous when the friendship formed. He had been famous for a decade. He was perhaps the most genuinely iconic film star of his generation, the man whose face and whose particular quality of physical presence had come to represent something about American masculinity in the 1960s that no other actor had managed to represent with equivalent authority. He was also, underneath the fame and the iconic status, and the particular mythology that Hollywood had built around him, a man who was genuinely interested in the practice of martial arts for the reasons that serious practitioners are interested in it, which is the practice itself and what it produces in the man who pursues it honestly across enough time and enough genuine pressure. He had trained under Bruce Lee, he had trained in karate, he had trained in jiu-jitsu. He had trained with the specific intensity of a man who understood that the training would tell him something true about himself if he was honest enough to hear what it was saying. Chuck had recognized that quality in McQueen immediately and had respected it and had built on that respect the friendship that lasted through the remainder of McQueen's life. Clear's throat. What the friendship also contained, in the specific way that friendships between genuinely competitive men tend to contain it, was the permanent low-level presence of the question that competitive men ask each other without ever quite asking it directly, which is the question of who the other man actually is when the situation requires him to be what he says he is. For most of the years of the friendship, that question had remained implicit. It had circulated beneath the surface of the friendship in the form of the specific teasing that serious men use to probe each other's confidence without committing to a direct challenge, the jokes that are not entirely jokes and the comments that carry just enough edge to be interesting. And then one evening in the late summer of 1980, at McQueen's ranch in Santa Paula, California, with the specific combination of physical comfort and emotional candor that a long evening at a man's own place produces in him when he is with someone he trusts and has had enough to drink to say the thing he has been not quite saying for the better part of a decade, Steve McQueen said it directly. He told Chuck Norris that he could take him in a real fight. He said it with the combination of humor and genuine intent that characterizes the statements men make when they have been thinking something for a long time and have finally decided that the thinking has gone on long enough without the saying. Steve McQueen was 50 years old that summer. The ranch at Santa Paula was a recent acquisition, a working property in the hills above the city where he had been spending increasing amounts of time as his relationship with Los Angeles and with the film industry had grown more complicated in the way that men's relationships with the things that made them famous tend to grow more complicated as the fame accumulates and the cost of maintaining the relationship with the thing that produced the fame becomes clearer. He had not made a film in 2 years. He was working on what would become his final picture. A project he was approaching with the specific deliberateness of a man who understands that the thing he is making matters and intends to make it well regardless of what the schedule or the studio or the commercial calculus of the moment might prefer. He was also sick, though the full extent of what he was sick with had not yet been definitively established, and he was managing the uncertainty with the same quality he had brought to every difficult thing in his life, which was the quality of a man who had grown up hard and had learned early that the appropriate response to difficult things was to continue moving through them rather than to stop and examine them from a safe distance. Snorts. He had maintained his training across the years of the friendship with Chuck, not at the intensity of his earlier practice, but consistently, in the way that men who have built a genuine relationship with the practice maintain it even when the life around the practice has changed enough that the time and energy available for it have been reduced. He moved well for a man of 50 who had spent the previous 3 decades driving motorcycles and racing cars and performing a higher percentage of his own stunts than any insurance underwriter had ever been comfortable approving. He was 5'10" and lean in the specific way that physical men who have stayed active across decades are lean, without bulk but with the underlying density of a body that has been asked to do real things for a long time, and has organized itself around the requirement. And he had, threaded through the genuine warmth and the genuine humor and the genuine decency that the people who knew him best consistently described as the essential qualities of the man underneath the icon, a competitive streak that had never fully quieted regardless of what the decade or the circumstance or the professional moment required of him. The competitive streak was not hostile. It was not the aggression of a man who needed to dominate the people around him to feel secure. It was the specific competitiveness of a man who has spent his life finding out what he is capable of and who has developed through that finding out a genuine and abiding interest in the same question as it applies to the men he respects most. And in the autumn of 1980, at his ranch in Santa Paula with a long evening behind him and Chuck Norris across the table from him, the competitive streak produced the statement that it had been quietly building toward for 9 years. Clear's throat, Chuck was 40 years old that summer. He had been retired from full-contact competition for 6 years. Walker, Texas Ranger, was more than a decade in the future. The film career was ongoing and building steadily, if not yet at the peak it would reach in the following years. He had been coming to the ranch at Santa Paula on and off across the previous year, drawn partly by the genuine pleasure of McQueen's company and partly by the specific quality of the conversations that happened there, which were the conversations of a man who had thought seriously about things and who expected the people he chose to have around him to have thought seriously about things and who had no patience for the performance of seriousness as a substitute for the actual thing. They had talked about martial arts many times across those evenings, about training philosophy and the relationship between physical discipline and mental clarity and the question of what genuine capability looked like versus what performed capability looked like. McQueen's opinions on these subjects were the opinions of a man who had been inside the practice seriously enough to have real opinions, rather than the borrowed ones that casual practitioners tend to carry. And Chuck had always engaged with them honestly rather than managing them the way a man manages the opinions of someone he does not take seriously. Snorts. The evening in question had begun in the early afternoon with the particular leisure of a late summer day on a working ranch, when the work has been done and the light is long and the man whose place it is has decided to let the evening take whatever shape it wants to take. They had eaten outside. They had talked about the film McQueen was preparing, and about the action genre, and about the state of the martial arts world, and about several things that had nothing to do with any of those subjects. The conversation had moved the way conversations move between men who have been talking honestly with each other for long enough that they do not need to manage the movement, which is wherever the honest thing to say next happens to point. Clear's throat. It was somewhere in the 3rd hour of the evening, with the Santa Paula hills going dark around the edges of the property and the specific quality of ease that long evenings at a man's own place produce settling over both of them, that McQueen said the thing. He said it in the tone that men use when they are being simultaneously serious and not entirely serious, the tone that allows the statement to be the statement while also providing both men with the option of treating it as something lighter if the statement turns out to be more than the room can comfortably contain. He said that he had been training for most of his adult life. He said that the training had been serious and that the men who had taught him had been serious and that the things he had learned from them had been tested in enough real contexts across enough years to have produced in him a genuine and not merely theoretical capability. And then he said that if it ever came to a genuine physical exchange between the two of them, one without rules and without the managed conditions of a training environment, he believed he could take Chuck Norris. He said it. He looked at Chuck across the table with the direct, clear-eyed confidence of a man who has decided to say the thing and is now saying it, and is watching to see what the saying produces. Snorts? Chuck looked at him. The look lasted long enough for the specific quality of it to become its own kind of communication before any words were attached to it. It was not a threatening look. It was not the look of a man gathering himself for a response that the other man should be concerned about. It was something more interesting than either of those things, which was the look of a man who has just been given an honest piece of information about his friend, and is taking a moment to appreciate the honesty of it before he decides what to do with it. He had known Steve McQueen for 9 years. He had trained alongside him and eaten with him, and talked with him across hundreds of hours in various locations and in various states of the kind of openness that genuine friendship between serious men produces over time. He knew what McQueen was. He knew the quality of the training, and the quality of the mind behind the training, and the genuine courage that had characterized McQueen's engagement with every difficult thing his life had presented him with. He also knew, with the specific and irreducible certainty that 30 years of genuine physical testing at the highest available level of competition produces in a man, exactly what the statement McQueen had just made would produce if the statement were tested against the reality it referred to. Clear's throat. He said that he appreciated the confidence. He said it genuinely. He said that McQueen moved better than almost anyone he had trained alongside who had not competed professionally, and that the instincts were good and the timing was better than the instincts. He said all of this as factual observation rather than as the diplomatic preamble to a correction, because it was factual observation and Chuck had no interest in the diplomatic version of a thing when the honest version was available. Then he said that he would be happy to find out. He said it the way he said most things, which was simply and without the vocal architecture that men sometimes use to make an invitation sound more significant than the words themselves. He gestured toward the open flat section of ground between the edge of the porch and the beginning of the ranch's working area, a dirt and grass surface perhaps 20 feet across in the specific even quality of the Santa Paula evening light, which was the light of a late summer evening in the California hills that makes everything it falls on look both ordinary and significant at the same time. Snorts. McQueen looked at the patch of ground. He looked at Chuck. He was 50 years old and had been training seriously for 20 years and had just said a thing out loud that he had been thinking for 9 years, and the man across from him had just made the thinking testable in the simplest available way, which was by gesturing at a flat patch of ground and saying he would be happy to find out. He stood up from the table. He pulled off the light jacket he had been wearing against the evening cool and set it on the back of the chair. Underneath he was wearing a plain gray t-shirt. He kept the jeans. He kept the boots. He walked to the center of the flat section of ground between the porch and the working area in the specific way that Steve McQueen walked toward difficult things, which was directly and without any of the hesitation that most people discover between their intention and the action that carries out the intention. He stopped in the middle of the open ground and turned around and stood with his weight even on both feet, and his hands loose at his sides, and his eyes on Chuck with the bright, direct attention of a man who has committed to something and is now present for it without reservation. Clear's throat, Chuck stepped off the porch. He was wearing dark jeans and a plain blue shirt and the boots he wore on the ranch. He did not remove the shirt. He did not take a stance. He walked to the center of the open ground and stopped 8 feet from McQueen and stood with his hands at his sides and his weight distributed evenly, and his eyes on his friend with the open, patient quality of attention that he brought to the beginning of any genuine exchange. The Santa Paula hills held the last of the day's light at their edges. The ranch around them was quiet in the specific way that working properties in the California hills go quiet at the end of a summer day. Nobody else was present. The two men stood in the fading light with 8 feet of California earth between them and the question that McQueen had been asking for 9 years, finally available to be answered. McQueen came forward. He came forward the way he did most physical things, which was with a commitment so complete that the commitment itself communicated something about the man before any technique was applied. He threw a right hand that was fast in the way that a man who has trained his hands seriously for 20 years has fast hands. Genuinely fast. Fast enough that the people who had trained alongside him across those 20 years had noted it and respected it. Snorts, Chuck slipped it by rotating his left shoulder inside the punch in the compact movement that costs nothing in terms of positioning and gives nothing away in terms of intention. The right hand went past. In the same motion, Chuck moved his left foot slightly forward and to the outside and redirected McQueen's committed right arm with the heel of his right palm, a contact that was precise enough and timed accurately enough that McQueen's own forward momentum carried him a half step further than his intention had directed him, and in the additional half step the geometry of his balance shifted in the specific way that balance shifts when a forward committed body encounters a precisely timed redirection at exactly the wrong moment for the body's weight distribution to absorb it. McQueen caught himself, one hand on the ground, one knee on the California earth. He was on the ground for approximately 2 seconds before he was back on his feet and turning around. He looked at Chuck. Chuck looked at him, The 8 feet between them held the specific quality of a space in which something has just been settled. McQueen was breathing in the way that a committed physical effort produces breathing. Chuck was breathing in the way that a man breathes who has applied precise technique at short range without committing more than the technique required. The difference in the breathing of the two men communicated something that the two men understood simultaneously and did not need to say anything about to understand completely. Clear's throat, McQueen bent down and picked up the hat that had come off when he went to the ground. He turned it over once in his hands and put it back on and adjusted the brim. He looked at Chuck across the 8 feet of California earth. Then something happened in his face that the people who knew Steve McQueen across the decades of his public life and his private life would have recognized immediately as one of the genuine expressions. The expressions that were his rather than performances constructed for an audience. The corners of his mouth moved, not a full smile. The specific movement that a man's face makes when he has just found out something true about himself, and the true thing is not what he hoped it would be, and he is honestly all right with that, because the finding out was the point, and the finding out is now complete. He said one thing. He said that he had been wondering about that for 9 years. He said it in the tone of a man who has been carrying a question across a long time and has finally set it down and is experiencing the specific lightness that follows the setting down of something that has been carried longer than it needed to be carried. Snorts, Chuck said that it was a good right hand. He said it without qualification. He said that the timing was better than most people he had trained with who had not competed at the level where timing was the variable that determined everything. He said it in the direct way that he offered honest assessments of genuine capability, which was without the diplomatic softening that makes an honest assessment feel like a consolation prize. He meant it. He said it because it was true and because McQueen was a man who deserved the true version rather than the managed version, and because the friendship they had built across 9 years was built on the understanding that the true version was always what the other man was going to get regardless of whether the true version was comfortable. McQueen nodded once. He picked up the jacket from the porch railing where Chuck had draped it when he stepped off the porch. He handed it to Chuck. They walked back to the table. They sat down. The evening continued. Clear's throat. Steve McQueen died on November 7, 1980, 11 weeks after the evening at the Santa Paula Ranch. He died from the complications of a cancer that had been advancing through him across the months of that final year, and that the treatments he had pursued with the same combination of stubbornness and hope that he had brought to every difficult thing in his life had not been sufficient to reverse. He was 50 years old. The film he had been preparing, Tom Horn, had been released in February of that year. His final film, The Hunter, was released in July, 4 months before he died, and 3 months before the evening at Santa Paula. He did not know when he sat across the table from Chuck Norris in the fading light of that late summer evening and said the thing he had been not quite saying for 9 years that he had 11 weeks remaining. He knew he was sick. He did not know the accounting of what the sickness had left him. Snorts. Chuck did not speak publicly about the evening at the Santa Paula Ranch. He had a principle about encounters that had finished, which was that the encounter contained what it contained, and that language applied to it afterward diminished rather than honored what was inside it. He kept the principle. He kept it for the rest of his life. He spoke about McQueen in interviews across the decades after his death in the way that a man speaks about a friend he has genuinely lost, which is carefully and with the specific attention to accuracy that genuine loss produces in the people who carry it. He said that McQueen was one of the most committed practitioners he had ever trained alongside. He said that the combination of physical instinct and competitive courage was exceptional, and that the quality of the engagement was the quality of a man who was in it for what it actually was rather than what it looked like from the outside. He said these things and meant them, and they were true. He did not say anything about an evening in Santa Paula or a patch of California earth or a right hand that was genuinely fast or a hat picked up from the ground or a 9-year question finally answered and set down. The friendship had contained those things. The friendship was complete, the principle held. The people who knew both men, and who understood enough about what the practice of martial arts genuinely produces in the men who pursue it honestly across long periods of time have said, in various ways, and in various contexts across the years since McQueen's death, that the quality of the friendship between the two men was the kind of quality that is only produced between men who are genuinely honest with each other about what they are and what they are not. That kind of honesty requires, at some point in any friendship between competitive men, the willingness to ask the question that has been circulating beneath the surface and to ask it in a form that permits a real answer rather than a diplomatic one. McQueen asked it in the late summer of 1980 at his ranch in the Santa Paula Hills. He asked it in the most direct form available to him, which was the form that said what he believed out loud to the man it concerned and accepted whatever the real answer turned out to be. The real answer arrived in 2 seconds on a patch of California earth in the fading evening light, and McQueen received it in the specific way that honest men receive honest answers to honest questions, which is with the acknowledgement that the answer is what it is, and that knowing what it is better than not knowing, regardless of what the knowing costs. He had been wondering for 9 years, he found out. He set the wondering down, he went back to the table, the evening continued. That was the kind of man he was. And the friendship that produced that evening, and the man across the table who answered the question it contained with the same honesty that the question had been asked with, was the kind of friendship and the kind of man that the practice pursued with genuine seriousness across enough time and enough genuine pressure occasionally has the grace to produce.